My father-in-law looked me dead in the eye and called me trash at the dinner table. He said I wasn't enough for his son. I couldn't believe it. The room went silent, and everyone looked uncomfortable. My husband, Brandon, didn't say a word. I felt small and hurt, but deep inside, I knew I couldn't let him get away with treating me this way. That night, I stayed up thinking about everything Richard had said. I had worked so hard to support Brandon and our life together. I sacrificed a lot, and yet he acted like I was worthless. I realized he had always been controlling and proud, obsessed with his image and power. That was his weakness, and I decided I would not let him intimidate me anymore. The next morning, I started quietly taking steps to protect myself and make things right. I knew Richard had many secrets, and he cared too much about his reputation. I began gathering small pieces of information about his business mistakes and personal errors. I didn't want to fight him openly. I just wanted him to see that he couldn't control everything and that his pride could hurt him. As I worked behind the scenes, I also talked to Brandon about his father's behavior. I wanted him to see the truth without feeling attacked. Slowly, he started noticing the unfairness in Richard's words and actions. He began understanding how much I had been carrying on my own and how strong I actually was. Then the first message came to Richard. It pointed out a serious mistake in one of his investments. He was confused and worried, not knowing where it came from. A second message followed, exposing another flaw that he had tried to hide from everyone. His confidence started to crumble. He didn't know that I was behind it all, but I watched quietly as he panicked. The third message went to his closest business partners, showing him for the arrogant, careless man he had been. Brandon finally realized the full picture and stood by my side. I revealed a little of what I had done, enough for Richard to see that he had underestimated me completely. He tried to argue, but I remained calm. I had defended myself and shown him the consequences of his cruelty. After that, our life changed. Brandon and I grew stronger as a couple, supporting each other equally. Richard had to face the truth about himself and his behavior. I felt empowered, knowing I had stood up for myself and set things right. I learned that intelligence, patience, and courage could turn even the worst insults into strength, and that no one has the right to make you feel worthless. The dinner started like any other family celebration, but I could feel the tension in the air. Richard, my father-in-law, hardly spoke at first, but his eyes never left me. When he finally opened his mouth, it was to criticize. He said my cooking wasn't good enough, even though I had spent hours preparing everything. Then he turned to my career, making jokes about how it didn't measure up to what he expected from someone married into his family. Every word felt like a dagger. Brandon didn't say anything. He just sat there, his face tight with embarrassment. I could see our guests shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Some tried to change the subject, but Richard ignored them, making sure all the attention stayed on me. I felt every insult deeply, like I was being stripped of my worth in front of everyone I knew. I wanted to speak up, to defend myself, but I held back. I didn't want to cause a scene, not yet. Inside, though, a fire was building. I felt small, betrayed, and furious all at once. How could someone treat me this way, in my own home, in front of my husband and family? I realized that staying quiet didn't mean I was weak. It meant I was planning. As the meal continued, Richard kept finding little ways to remind me of my place. He compared me to other women he thought were better, younger, smarter, or more accomplished. Every comparison cut deeper than the last. Brandon's silence made it worse, but it also made me see how much I would have to rely on myself. I couldn't count on him to fight my battles, not with his father present. By the time dessert arrived, I had made a silent promise to myself. No one, not Richard, not anyone, would ever make me feel worthless again. I would not allow his words or his pride to control my life or my confidence. The humiliation I felt that night became a turning point. It sparked a determination I hadn't realized I had. I decided that if he wanted to test me, he would soon learn that I was far stronger and smarter than he could imagine. Even as I smiled politely and nodded at his words, my mind was already forming plans. I wouldn't humiliate him back in the same way. I would be careful, patient, and deliberate. I would show him that disrespecting me had consequences. That night, Richard thought he had broken me, but in reality, he had awakened something inside me. A resolve to never be looked down on again and to claim my own strength, no matter what it took. Every day, I worked harder than most people could imagine. I balanced my job with taking care of the house, making sure Brandon had everything he needed, and keeping our life together running smoothly. I often gave up my own dreams just to support him. Some nights, I stayed up late, finishing work while Brandon slept peacefully, unaware of the pressure I carried. It wasn't easy, and sometimes it felt like no one noticed all the effort I put in. When Richard insulted me at dinner, it cut deeper than I expected. The words didn't just attack me in that moment. They reminded me of the countless times I had been overlooked, undervalued, or dismissed quietly. He had no idea how much I sacrificed, how many late nights and early mornings I endured just to keep our lives afloat. To him, none of that mattered. To him, I was not enough. I felt the sting of his judgment, but I also realized something important. His opinion did not define me. The frustration and hurt I felt became fuel for determination. I started thinking carefully about my life, my work, and the way I could protect myself from his cruelty. I knew I couldn't rely on anyone else to defend me. Brandon was too polite, too embarrassed, too unsure of how to stand up to his father. I would have to find a way to stand strong on my own. I began quietly observing Richard, learning his habits and weaknesses. I noticed how much he cared about his reputation and how prideful he was about his wealth and business. I realized that if I could be smart and patient, I could create ways to make him respect me, or at least understand that he couldn't treat me like this anymore. I didn't want revenge in the angry sense. I wanted justice and security for myself. While working long hours and managing our home, I started planning small steps. Each day, I thought about how to protect my future and ensure I wouldn't be humiliated like that again. I reminded myself that my worth wasn't measured by anyone else, especially not by Richard's harsh words. He only saw what he wanted to see, not the full picture of who I was. Even though I felt vulnerable and exhausted, I also felt a spark of strength I hadn't acknowledged before. I realized that I had survived countless challenges already, and that I could survive this too. Every insult, every judgment, every glance of disapproval became a reason to prove to myself that I was capable, intelligent, and deserving of respect. By the end of the week, I had started quietly putting plans into motion. I would protect myself, safeguard my life and my marriage, and show Richard, in my own way, that he had underestimated me completely. I felt a mixture of sadness and empowerment, a quiet determination that no one could break me, not even him. Do you want me to continue with the next part about Eliza discovering Richard's weaknesses in the same style? One evening, I stayed late in the living room while Brandon went to make a call. Richard was on the phone in his study, not realizing I could hear him. At first, I only caught bits and pieces, but soon it became clear what he was saying. He was bragging to a business partner about how much control he had over Brandon and how easy it was to manipulate his family. The arrogance in his voice was shocking, but it also gave me something I hadn't had before, an advantage. He talked endlessly about his wealth and influence, as if those things gave him the right to judge everyone around him. He laughed about how he could make decisions for his children and even humiliate people like me without consequences. I realized that he valued appearances and reputation above everything else, and that pride could make him careless. He wasn't invincible, he was just very confident in his own image. Then I overheard something that made my heart race. He mentioned a secret business deal, something risky that hadn't been made public yet. From what I understood, if the details got out, it could cause serious trouble for him. I didn't fully know all the specifics, but I knew enough to see that he had vulnerabilities. This was the first real opening I had to protect myself, and perhaps teach him a lesson he wouldn't forget. I sat quietly, letting every word sink in. It was clear that his strength was mostly a show, a mask he wore to make everyone believe he was untouchable. Behind that mask was pride, obsession with control, and fear of losing face. These were things I could use carefully and subtly, without putting myself at risk. From that moment, a plan began to take shape in my mind. I didn't want to attack him openly or make a scene. I wanted to act smart slowly, using the knowledge I had gained. I realized that I could turn his arrogance against him and make him see that treating me like trash had consequences he hadn't imagined. I could protect my marriage, my dignity, and my future while keeping him unaware of exactly what was happening. I spent the next few days quietly gathering more information, paying attention to details he mentioned in conversations, and noticing how he interacted with others. Every careless boast, every slight exaggeration, every moment of pride became a piece of the puzzle. I felt a mixture of fear and determination. Fear because I had to be careful, and determination because I knew I could outsmart him if I stayed patient. By the end of the week, I was ready to begin taking subtle steps. I knew Richard's weaknesses, and I understood the power of careful planning. I felt more confident than I had in months. He had underestimated me, and now I had a path to make sure he realized exactly how wrong he had been. I wasn't angry for the sake of anger. I wanted justice and security for myself and Brandon. And with that knowledge, I was finally ready to act. I didn't rush into anything. I knew that if I acted out of anger, I would make mistakes. So I started with small, careful steps, quiet enough that no one would notice, but strong enough to shake the ground under Richard little by little. The first chance came during a family gathering when some of Richard's business associates stopped by. They were discussing one of his new projects, and he was bragging about how perfect the plan was. I listened quietly, and when one of the men asked a question, I gently pointed out a small detail that didn't add up. I did it politely, almost as if I were confused, not accusing. The room went still for a moment. Then one of the associates frowned and said he hadn't thought about that point before. Richard gave me a sharp look, but he couldn't say much without looking insecure. That tiny doubt was enough. It planted a seed in their minds that maybe Richard wasn't as flawless as he claimed. After that, I continued to stay calm and friendly on the outside, but behind the scenes, I became more strategic. I used the information I had gathered about his secret business deal. I didn't expose anything openly. Instead, I sent a quiet, anonymous message to a legal advisor connected to the company involved. I only raised a question, nothing more. I knew that one question in the right place could start a chain reaction. Days later, I heard Richard complaining on the phone about an unexpected review of the deal. He was irritated, confused, and clearly stressed. I kept my face neutral and acted like I had no idea what was happening. Each evening, I used whatever free time I had to go through documents, public records, and online filings. Richard wasn't as careful as he thought. Over the years, he had made several small mistakes. Nothing criminal, but enough to make him look irresponsible if they came to light. I saved everything quietly. Whenever I found something useful, I made sure it reached the right people without any trace leading back to me. I never said anything to Richard. I didn't argue, didn't confront him, and didn't show even a hint of anger. I treated him politely, the same way I always had. That made it easier for him to believe that I was harmless. Meanwhile, the people around him started noticing cracks in his confidence. A few of his associates began asking more questions instead of blindly agreeing with him. His assistant looked more tired than usual. Even Brandon mentioned that his father seemed more stressed lately. I simply nodded and stayed supportive, acting like I knew nothing. Inside, I felt a quiet strength growing. I wasn't trying to destroy him. I was showing him that he couldn't walk over me without consequences. Every subtle step I took reminded me that I wasn't powerless. I could protect myself, and I could do it with grace. No one suspected a thing. And that was exactly what I wanted. I knew I could not confront Richard directly, so I focused on helping Brandon see the truth on his own. I didn't push or complain. Instead, I shared small, simple things that Brandon could not ignore. When Richard made a rude comment, I repeated it later in a calm way, letting Brandon hear how harsh it sounded. When Richard changed plans at the last minute and inconvenienced everyone, I gently pointed it out as something that seemed unfair. I never attacked Richard's character. I only mentioned what had actually happened. Little by little, Brandon began noticing the patterns. He started seeing how his father always put himself first, and how he expected everyone to follow whatever he said without question. I could see the confusion in Brandon's eyes when he compared his father's words to his actions. Sometimes Brandon would defend his father at first, but the more he saw, the quieter he became. The moments that once felt normal to him now looked different. He noticed how Richard interrupted people, how he dismissed opinions, and how he acted like he owned every room he walked into. These were things he had grown up accepting, but now he was finally questioning them. Whenever Brandon brought up something that bothered him, I listened. I didn't add extra details or try to influence him too strongly. I just let him talk, and he slowly connected the dots himself. He began to understand that his father's behavior was not strength. It was selfishness. As Brandon pulled away emotionally, Richard felt it. He sensed that something was changing, but he didn't know why. He noticed Brandon wasn't as quick to agree with him. He noticed I didn't react to his insults anymore. He tried to regain control, but nothing worked. Richard began feeling alone at moments where he once felt powerful. His comments didn't land the same way. His presence didn't intimidate people the way it used to. The emotional shift was slow but real, and he could feel it happening. But he had no idea where it was coming from. Brandon didn't accuse him of anything. I didn't argue. Everything around Richard simply started becoming heavier, colder, and quieter. The emotional betrayal hit him harder because he couldn't explain why his son was pulling back. I continued being steady and calm. I didn't need to say much. Brandon was finally seeing what I had seen for years, and Richard was now facing the consequences of the cruelty he had thrown at others so easily. This was only the beginning of the change he would experience, and he had no idea the worst part was still ahead. One morning, I noticed Richard acting unusually tense, and then the first message arrived. It was a legal notice highlighting a serious flaw in one of his investments. I watched him read it over and over, his face pale, his hands shaking slightly as he tried to call his assistant for answers. No one could explain where it had come from, and I stayed quiet, pretending I didn't notice. Before he could even recover from the first shock, another message arrived. This one exposed a personal secret he had worked hard to hide. I saw him tense up, his chest tightening, and for the first time, he looked vulnerable. He tried to stay calm, but the fear in his eyes was impossible to hide. I could see cracks forming in the empire he had always seemed so proud of. Richard was usually confident, sure of every decision, but now he seemed trapped. He kept checking messages, calling contacts, asking questions, but no one could tell him anything. I stayed composed, letting him struggle while I quietly observed. Every small sign of his panic made me more certain that my plan was working. He was trying to regain control, pacing around, rereading everything, but nothing I had done was obvious. He began doubting his own judgment, wondering if someone close to him had betrayed him. It was satisfying to see him realize that his pride and arrogance made him vulnerable. Even his family started noticing the change. I watched him speak to Brandon and others, trying to maintain his usual strong image, but tension and fear slipped through his expressions. He tried to act normal, but I could see how shaken he really was. He had no idea who was behind the messages. His confusion and panic made him angry, but he had no target. Every glance, every comment, even the simplest actions of those around him, seemed like threats to him. I stayed calm, doing nothing overt, letting him feel powerless while the situation unfolded exactly as I had planned. By the end of the morning, Richard was completely off balance. The legal notice and the exposure of his secret had thrown him into chaos. I could see how deeply shaken he was, and it gave me a quiet satisfaction. His empire, once untouchable in his mind, was suddenly fragile. For the first time, I watched him realize that his pride and control had limits. He had underestimated me completely, and now he had no idea that I was the one quietly orchestrating everything. His fear, confusion, and vulnerability were proof that I had started to turn the tables, and I knew this was just the beginning. I waited patiently, knowing the right moment to act. The third message was carefully prepared and sent directly to Richard's closest business partners. It revealed his arrogance and how poorly he had managed some of his recent decisions. I stayed quiet, keeping my distance, but I watched closely as the results unfolded. Almost immediately, I could see the effect. Messages and calls started coming in not for me, but for him. Questions, concerns, and doubts appeared where there had once been trust. His partners began second-guessing his decisions. Richard's face grew pale, his voice tighter, and he looked around as if trying to figure out what was happening. His credibility, the thing he had always relied on, began to crumble right before my eyes. Brandon noticed the change too. He stopped standing silently on the side and began speaking up. He defended me when Richard tried to blame someone or act superior. Brandon looked at me differently now. For the first time, he truly saw my strength and intelligence. I felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing he was finally understanding the truth, that I had been more capable and careful than anyone had given me credit for. I didn't rush to reveal myself. I let Richard struggle with the consequences of his own actions first. I stayed composed, calm, and patient, letting him feel the full weight of his mistakes. I watched as he tried to respond, trying to cover up his errors, but every move he made only made things worse. He couldn't trace the source of the messages, and that confusion and fear gave me control without me saying a single word. Finally, when Richard was at his most unsettled, I revealed my involvement, but only a little at first. I spoke calmly, without accusation, showing him that I had been the one orchestrating everything from behind the scenes. I saw the moment it hit him. His eyes widened, his mouth slightly opened, and for a moment he looked completely stunned. He realized he had underestimated me entirely. Brandon stood by me, proud and supportive. Richard's anger and pride couldn't hide his shock. He had treated me as weak, but now he saw the truth. I was smart, patient, and capable of taking action when needed. The control he had always believed he held over me, and even Brandon, had vanished in an instant. In that moment, I felt a mix of relief and quiet triumph. I hadn't acted out of anger. I had acted with purpose. The plan worked exactly as I had intended, showing Richard the consequences of underestimating someone he thought he could dismiss. I watched him absorb it, humbled and shaken, while Brandon and I stood together stronger than ever. Richard finally came to me, his face red with anger and disbelief. "You ruined everything," he shouted, pointing his finger at me. I stayed calm, meeting his eyes without flinching. I didn't raise my voice or argue. I knew getting angry wouldn't help. "I didn't ruin anything," I said quietly. "I only showed the truth. I defended myself because I wasn't going to let you treat me like I was nothing. I made sure you understood that your behavior has consequences." I could see the shock in his eyes. He hadn't expected me to speak so calmly, so confidently. Brandon stepped closer to me, placing a hand on my shoulder. His presence made me feel stronger. He looked at his father and said, "Mom's right. You can't keep treating people this way and expect no one to respond." I felt relief wash over me. Brandon finally saw things clearly and supported me fully. Richard tried to interrupt, to argue, to blame me for the chaos with his business partners, but I let him talk. I didn't need to convince him with anger. Every word he said only proved my point, that he had been arrogant, careless, and cruel for far too long. I reminded him again, calmly, that I didn't act out of revenge for the sake of hurting him. I acted to protect myself, and to show him that treating people unfairly can have consequences. I told him he had underestimated me, and that his pride had been his weakness. He didn't respond, only stared at me, humiliated and quiet. Brandon squeezed my shoulder, silently showing me that he understood everything. His eyes were filled with pride and respect. I felt a sense of justice, not from punishment, but from standing up for myself and finally being recognized as strong and capable. Richard's anger slowly faded into silence. I could see he was processing what had happened, realizing he had no control over me anymore. The power he thought he had, the ability to judge and belittle, was gone. I had faced his cruelty without losing my calm, and I had shown him that his actions were unacceptable. I looked at him one last time and said, "I did what I had to do for myself and for my life with Brandon. Nothing more." I didn't need to say anything else. The lesson had been learned. Richard was humiliated, but I felt no glee in it. I only felt the quiet strength of knowing I had defended myself with patience, intelligence, and dignity. Brandon and I stood together, stronger than ever, and for the first time, our family dynamic began to shift in a way that respected both of us. This moment wasn't about revenge. It was about self-respect, fairness, and finally being seen for who I really am. After everything that happened, Brandon and I grew closer than ever. We started making decisions together, sharing responsibilities, and supporting each other equally. Our marriage felt stronger because we finally understood each other completely. I no longer felt like I had to carry everything alone, and Brandon respected my opinions and choices in ways he hadn't before. Richard became quiet and distant. He couldn't ignore what had happened or how his actions had backfired. Slowly, I could see him reflecting on his behavior, how he had judged me unfairly, humiliated me, and tried to control our lives. I didn't need to say anything to him. The events themselves made him realize the consequences of his arrogance. I felt a new sense of strength inside me. I had faced insults, disrespect, and manipulation, but I had remained patient and calm. I had acted carefully and strategically, and it had worked. I learned that intelligence, planning, and self-respect are more powerful than anger or pride. I had stood up for myself without losing my dignity, and that made me feel empowered. Our daily life began to change. Brandon and I communicated more openly, trusted each other, and shared our thoughts without fear. We celebrated small victories together, supported each other's goals, and became a true team. I felt proud of how far we had come and confident that we could handle anything together. Richard's influence over us diminished. He realized he could no longer control our choices or belittle me without consequences. The power he thought he held had disappeared, and his arrogance had taught him a hard lesson. I didn't need revenge to feel satisfied. Seeing him reflect on his actions was enough. Looking back, I understood the most important lesson. Never underestimate someone's intelligence or inner strength. People who appear quiet or patient can be far stronger than they seem. Pride can make even the cruelest people fall, and arrogance can blind them to the truth. I felt resilient, knowing I had protected myself, my marriage, and my dignity. I had shown that patience, calm thinking, and careful action can overcome cruelty and unfairness. I also knew that true strength comes not from hurting others, but from standing up for yourself and creating positive change in your own life. At the end, I felt proud, empowered, and ready for whatever came next. I had learned that courage, intelligence, and self-respect are the strongest tools anyone can have, and they can change lives in ways no one expects.